Justin Fields is struggling at Jets training camp, but that's no reason to panic. In fact, it's pretty meaningless. Locked On Jets begins now.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It is Thursday, August 7th, 2025, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thank you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day, and a big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. On today's show, we have our weekly mailbag. Normally we do our mailbags each Wednesday, but we pushed this week's back to Thursday. Thanks so much to everybody who sent in questions. Let's begin. Our first question is about Justin Fields. John, the recent reports from Jets practice at training camp have not been good for Justin Fields. Sounds like he's struggling consistently. How concerned should Jets fans be? That's a good question. And yes, one of the ongoing themes of Jets training camp, at least the early stages of Jets training camp, have been that Justin Fields has been struggling. Aside from one day over the weekend, there have been a lot of negative reports about his performance in these practices. I don't think you should be any more worried than you were about Justin Fields entering training camp. I don't think you should be any less worried than you were about Justin Fields entering training camp. I don't think the results of these practices are all that important. I think that what's happening right now is the Jets are preparing for the season. You know, the key word in training camp is training. The Jets are putting in a new system. They're learning how to operate these plays. You have a lot of new pieces on the offense. These guys are learning how to work with each other. Fields is adjusting to his new wide receivers. He's adjusting to a new playbook. And I think we forget, like, part of the reason you have training camp is to kind of work out the problems now, because the first time you try and execute a play, it's probably not going to be executed in a top-notch manner. How significant is training camp? Well, how often do we look back when a player either has a good season or a bad season? You know, let's say we get to January, the player's either had a great season or a bad season. Do you ever remember what that guy did in training camp? Not really. I think a lot of this analysis is kind of the nature of the NFL media landscape, where there's so much coverage. You know, the NFL is now a league that's covered 24/7, 365. You have all these, NFL Network, you have ESPN focused on it. All of these, all of these media companies, not to mention podcasts such as this. There's a lot more exposure than there was, when I was growing up 30 years ago. 30 years ago, maybe you'd get, like, your team would get one segment on SportsCenter on ESPN. You'd watch the local news, you'd read the local newspapers, but there wasn't as much glare as there is today. And I think that, like, there are good parts and bad parts about this media landscape, because fans can become so much more educated on the game than they could when I was growing up. When I was growing up, we had, like, no X's and O's analysis. You maybe get, like, a segment on one of the pregame shows. Ron Jaworski on ESPN would have a couple segments on Monday Night Countdown. Occasionally a writer would give us, like, an indication on how a play went in the newspaper. Like, there's so many resources you can access now. You can go far deeper into the game than you ever did in the past. The idea of a website like Pro Football Focus existing in the 1990s was something beyond our wildest comprehension. But I think there are drawbacks. And I think one of the biggest drawbacks is, and this is not just true in football, I think it's true across, like, our sports landscape. People get this idea that, like, every single thing that happens needs some profound takeaway from it. And that's not always the case. Sometimes stuff just happens, and there's nothing to take away from it. And I think, like, the media coverage of these training camp practices is a good example. Jets are trying to get ready for the season here. It's not really a big deal if, like, they have a rough day at practice. It's not really a big deal if they have a rough couple days at practice. It's not something to get overly worried about. I mean, if Justin Fields was lighting it up at training camp, I would not be going around saying Justin Fields is going to have a great season. It's, I don't think we need to have a huge takeaway whenever there's an incomplete pass. And I think that training camp stats are one of the most ridiculous things I've ever heard of. JJ Watt, the legendary pass rusher, actually had a pretty good take on this. You can check that out. Watt just kind of mocked the idea of training camp stats, because he said a lot of the stuff that I'm saying. So, I'm kind of paraphrasing what JJ Watt says. This is about getting ready for the season. It's about preparing. In some cases, you're practicing very specialized situations. In some cases, like you're practicing a 3rd and long play where the odds are tilted in the defense's favor. I don't know how good Justin Fields is going to be this year. As I was saying to my friend Michael Nania the other day, I think it's a situation where it's probably not going to work out that well for the Jets, because it usually doesn't work out that well when you get a former first round pick who hasn't really reached his potential. Usually it doesn't pan out, these reclamation projects. I just don't know what the better option was for the Jets in 2025 than Justin Fields. Maybe you like Daniel Jones better as a reclamation project. I could see that. Maybe you just said we're going to punt at quarterback and we bring in someone like Jameis Winston. And Jameis Winston would probably give you something comparable to like Aaron Rodgers' 2024 production at 10% of 10% of Rodgers' 2024 salary. And I guess that wouldn't have been the worst thing in the world. In a world where Atlanta had cut Kirk Cousins then could have been signed for the league minimum. I feel like that maybe would have been a justifiable reclamation project. But name me one of those options to get you excited. They're all bad options. The Jets had no good options at the quarterback position this offseason. I didn't think they were very likely to draft somebody high in the spring. So the Jets kind of had to go with one of these options that was unappealing. And I think Fields is probably the one that gives you the most upside, because Fields does at least have some track record of high-end play. He hasn't done it consistently, and there are reasons for that. But you have to go into the season understanding that the odds are kind of working against Justin Fields. He was just the least bad of a lot of bad options that were in front of the Jets. And I think you need to acknowledge that, even if this works out for Fields, even if Fields has a good season, based on his track record, there are likely to be weeks where the Jets offense looks completely inept, because Fields has not been a consistent quarterback through his career. I think the hope is that he'll remain inconsistent, but the good will happen more frequently and the bad will happen less frequently. And a lot of that depends on aspects like the coaching staff, and it depends on how much Fields improves over the course of the season. But I can't get upset when he strings together a couple of bad practices in a row, because what will happen inevitably is that he'll put together another strong day at some point in the next week, and then the storyline will change. The storyline will be about the Justin Fields redemption arc. I don't think the players really care all that much about this stuff. Now, I think if the Jets actually were having a quarterback battle, I think if this is an open competition at the quarterback position, it would be noteworthy, because I think the coaches are probably marking down every snap. They're trying to get every piece of data they can before they make a decision. But that's if you have a position battle at the quarterback position. Jets have made it clear that they don't have a position battle at the quarterback position. I think that's the right move. Tyrod Taylor is a veteran leader in the locker room. Everybody respects Tyrod. I don't think Tyrod can really move an offense with the Jets personnel, though, because Tyrod's a guy who's going to protect the football. He'll get you in the right play. He'll get the ball where it needs to go on the first read, but he's not going to add a lot of splash plays. His ability to be a playmaker is really not that high at this point in his career. Even when he was starting in Buffalo, he wasn't a huge playmaker. He could occasionally add a big run with his legs. I think that's less true now. I think looking at Tyrod Taylor in his mid-30s, he's still mobile, but he's not going to be able to add a lot of big plays with his legs. Fields, I think the hope is that, he'll hit his first reads when they're open. He'll sprinkle in some deep balls, and he'll make it happen, playmaking with his legs. If he does that, the Jets offense could at least be functional. But we're not going to see that practice is not how we're going to figure that out. We'll figure it out once the regular season starts. Now, I had you on the Locked On Jets podcast. We'll turn our attention to the other side of the ball, the defensive line. Lots of faces, lots of new faces, lots of familiar faces, but different expectations for those familiar faces. We'll break it all down as we continue here on this Thursday mailbag edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. Summer sports are in full swing, and whether you're all about baseball under the lights, golf on the green, or high-stakes soccer action, FanDuel is the best way to make every game even more exciting. You're already following the action. Why not make it a little more thrilling? With FanDuel, you can get in on the game while your friends are getting sunburned on the beach. Baseball's exciting. We're nearing the home stretch of the regular season. We wish the Yankees and Mets were playing a little bit better, but FanDuel is the best way to get in on the action. And if you're looking forward to the NFL season, Jets over under 5.5 wins on FanDuel right now. Are you new to FanDuel? New customers can bet just $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if your first bet wins. Open the FanDuel app today or visit FanDuel.com to get started. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day. And a big shout out to you every dayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Let's continue now with our weekly mailbag. Our next question, John, how confident are you in this defensive line? Who are the key players that will make it work? Yeah, that's a good question. So this is not the defensive line the Jets had 2-3 years ago. Those Jets defensive lines were just stacked with talents, particularly at the defensive end position. I mean, 2 years ago at defensive end, you had John Franklin Myers, you had Jermaine Johnson, you had Bryce Huff, and you had a rookie Will McDonald. I mean, that's a very talented group on the defensive line. And Michael Clemens was your fourth or fifth defensive end. And Michael Clemens is fine as your fourth or fifth defensive end. The last couple of years, last year and this year, Clemens is now like in one of your top three defensive ends, which isn't so good. The way I describe the Jets defensive line is it's very good at the top and very lacking in depth. And at the top, there are some question marks. To me, the number one question mark on the defensive line is Jermaine Johnson. It's very difficult to criticize the player Jermaine has been to this point in his career. The question is, how will he recover from the Achilles? Because Achilles injuries in the NFL can alter your career. There's some injuries where guys will bounce back and be 100% almost all the time. And Achilles is a scary one. There are a lot of cases where guys can't come back from Achilles injuries and play at the same level. And if Jermaine can't, that really, really limits this defensive line because there's not much else at the defensive end position aside from Will McDonald. And on yesterday's show with my friend Michael Nania from Jets X Factor, I mentioned I think McDonald's going to have a big year. And the question is, will the bulk he put on, he's added some muscle this offseason. Will that get him to a point where you can play him against the run? Because last year, the Jets had to play him a lot because they didn't really have any good pass rushers outside of McDonald. That's Quinnen Williams was it. So they pretty much had to play McDonald I think they overexposed McDonald. He had to play on rundowns because they didn't have anybody else who could generate a pass rush in case, even if it was a rundown, sometimes the team throws and the Jets needed a pass rusher on the field. And McDonald was bad against the run. I mean, he was one of the worst run defenders at the defensive line among defensive linemen in the NFL. And it's not a surprise because he was one of the smallest defensive linemen in the NFL. So this offseason, he's added bulk. If McDonald can stay on the field, if he can be like a passable run defender, if he's a guy you can keep on the field against the run, then I see no reason why Will McDonald can't be a consistent 8 to 10 sack guy. And, he might even be more than that. But if he gets 8 to 10 sacks a year consistently, you got to be really happy with what you got in the first round in 2023. And it's funny, as much as that pick was criticized at the time, McDonald's on his way to being a very successful player in the NFL, and that pick is looking very good. If you remember at the time, the Jets had just completed the Aaron Rodgers trade. And one of the provisions of the Rodgers trade was the Jets traded the 13th pick to Green Bay in exchange for the 15th pick in the 2023 draft. So it was a pick swap. The Jets moved down 2 spots. And because they moved down 2 spots, that enabled the Steelers to trade in front of them to 14 to draft a tackle, Broderick Jones, out of Georgia. And you may remember at the time what I said was that, the Jets, I think everybody knows the Jets were going to take Jones if he fell to 15. And we didn't know how that was going to turn out. But one of the things I said at the time was sometimes in the NFL, you kind of luck out. And it was very possible that McDonald would end up being a better player than Jones. And the Jets, even though it was a terrible decision to put the pick swap into the trade, maybe it would work out for the Jets. And it seems that's how it's going to go because Jones has not played well in Pittsburgh. Meanwhile, McDonald's on his way to a successful career in the NFL. The defensive tackle position, I mean, it's all about Quinnen Williams. The Jets, I don't think Coward is that good. I don't think Nandi is that good. The 2 guys they brought in this offseason. The Leonard Taylor's a bit of a wild card. I think that everything's in front of Leonard Taylor for him to potentially become the number 2 defensive tackle. I think what we know is Leonard Taylor's at least a guy who can play effectively as a number 4 tackle, as somebody who gets a few snaps into rotation. But the question is, can he grow? And he's only in his second year, so he could grow into more than that. And I think it would be a good thing for the Jets. But I think for the Jets, the defensive line, it's very top heavy right now. You have some very good players at the top. You have one question mark in Jermaine Johnson. You have one kind of question mark in Leonard Taylor, and then a whole bunch of guys that just really aren't that great. Because then you start going down the defensive end list. You got Michael Clemens. I mean, can Braden McGregor turn into something? I guess it's possible, but it's not anything I'd want to bet on. So it's a defensive line with good players, but it's a defensive line really, really, really lacking in depth, which is quite a difference from 2 years ago. Our next question, John, what are some of the principles of the Detroit's offense? I'm trying to figure out what sort of system Tanner Engstrand is going to put in. It's a good question, but I don't think we should necessarily look to the Detroit offense, because I don't think Tanner Engstrand is going to put in a carbon copy of the Lions offense. And I'll say this, if Tanner Engstrand puts in the identical Detroit Lions offense, then he's probably not going to be a very good offensive coordinator, because the two quarterbacks, Jared Goff in Detroit and Justin Fields here, very different styles of quarterback. And the Jets really focused on getting Justin Fields. So I would imagine they got Justin Fields because they envisioned a certain scheme they could design around Fields, which has to be different from the scheme you design around Goff. Goff is really a creature of the pocket. He's not very mobile, whereas Fields is a guy who you can utilize his run game quite a bit. I think the Jets are going to have to, and this is going to be one of the test of Engstrand. For Fields to succeed, the Jets are going to have to put in a system that's very, very unique, that really accentuates the things Justin Fields does well and avoids the things he does poorly. So I think that first of all, you're going to need to see a very diverse package of design quarterback runs and design quarterback option plays, where the quarterback has the option of either handing the ball off to a back like Breece Hall or pulling it and running it himself. I think the Jets are going to have as big of a playbook of option plays as any team in the league. I think you're going to want to utilize the screen game a lot. That's not something that happened a lot in Detroit. Screens are actually generally not a very efficient way of moving the ball, but the Jets are lacking at receiver right now, which means that they have to manufacture offense another way. They have to manufacture a passing game the other way. And, the screen game, there are three backs who can catch the ball out of the backfield for the Jets. Breece Hall can, Braylon Allen can, Isaiah Davis can. And all three of them have the ability to do something after the catch. So I think you're going to want to see a heavy diet of screens. I also think you're going to want to see a lot of run-pass options. Detroit was not a huge RPO team with Jared Goff. Run-pass options are, they're exactly what they sound like. The quarterback, after the snap, reads one player and decides whether to throw the ball or hand the ball off. And in Fields' case, you can add in a component where he can either hand the ball off to a back or keep it himself. The way an RPO works is every guy in the defensive front has two assignments on a play, an assignment against the run and an assignment against the pass. So essentially you read one player. Usually it's a linebacker, and you see, is he playing the run? If he's playing the run, then you throw the ball, If he's playing the pass, then you hand the ball off. Essentially, you're putting a defender in conflict, and you're reading that defender, and because you're reading that defender, no matter what he does is wrong. And Fields can operate those plays at a pretty high level. So I think you're going to want to install a heavy package of those things. So this is not going to be the Detroit offense. You may see some certain concepts in the passing game that'll be similar. You might see some Detroit's like staple route combinations. You may see things the Jets do with formations that resemble what Detroit did. But I don't think you're going to see anything close to the same tendencies, because you really can't. The Jets can't install the offense the Detroit Lions ran last year with Justin Fields and expect it to work. Justin Fields, again, a very different quarterback from Jared Goff, who requires a different type of offense. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we're talking about a guy who's kind of under the microscope, and that's Malachi Corley. What can the Jets do to get him going? I think my answer is try everything. I'll explain what I mean as we continue here on this Thursday mailbag edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Yahoo Fantasy. It's the best time of year. NFL kickoff is almost here, and that means fantasy football season is back in full swing. And this year, Yahoo Fantasy is turning things up with a fantasy football experience like never before. This year, me and Locked On Jets are playing on Yahoo Fantasy, and you should too, whether you're a first-timer or a veteran making your millionth league. I've used Yahoo Fantasy for over 20 years, and the updates they're rolling out this month are wild, and I mean that in the best way. To celebrate 28 years of fantasy football greatness, Yahoo Fantasy is dropping 28 big new features over 28 days throughout August. And to kick it off, they just dropped the Yahoo Fantasy Guillotine Leagues, a killer new way to make fantasy football on Yahoo, where the lowest scoring team gets eliminated each week until there's one team left standing. With the season around the corner, now it's the time to get your league together and give this mode a try. If you're more into the classics, you can still play head-to-head private leagues or join a public league. Stay tuned for more killer announcements and start playing Yahoo Fantasy Football now at yahoofantasy.com/LockedOnNFL. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Thursday. Let's continue now with our weekly mailbag with a question from Tim, who writes, John, not knowing a lot about Malachi Corley after either watching college football or the Jets last year, I do know that he has a reputation for being a yak monster who thrives in chaos after the catch. Would this be a profile for a superlative kick or punt returner? Could this be his niche, a la Cordarrelle Patterson, who had a relatively late breakout as a receiver running back hybrid despite his draft position? Patterson was a multiple-time Pro Bowler as a kick returner, a talent that emerged early. I think you give it a try. I mean, I don't see any harm in trying Corley out during the preseason as a return guy and seeing what comes of it. I have to be honest with you, I'm not super high on Corley right now. I think that the biggest problem with Corley is that he's a wide receiver, and he doesn't really do any of the basic things that wide receiver needs to do to be successful in this league. And I think like one thing that kind of gets missed in all of this is the reason so many of his yards were yak yards in college. It wasn't because he was just like a monster after the catch, like an Anquan Bolden. It's more that he just caught a bunch of screens. And by definition, screens are plays where all of your yardage comes on yak yards after the catch yardage. So I think like Corley was kind of misbranded. I mean, the more I watch him, the more I hear about him, the more it seems to me like Robert Saleh and Joe Douglas just got excited by watching him run over a bunch of small school defensive backs in college. I mean, I'm always a little skeptical of a guy who makes his, who does his damage playing in space on manufactured touches, but isn't that fast and isn't that elusive. In fact, I think like a lot of the manufactured touches probably would be better served going to Arian Smith, because Smith is a guy who, has a lot of speed and has a lot of potentially could have a lot of playmaking ability. Look, I don't want to give up on Corley right now. I'm not saying the Jets should cut him today, but the Jets, I can't say I'm very optimistic about Corley. What I would say is I think the Jets should try everything with Corley. I mean, I think I've said this since he was drafted. I do wonder whether he might be better off, as Tim mentioned, in that like Cordarrelle Patterson role as a kind of a hybrid receiver, a running back. Because here's the thing, like even if Corley isn't a great wide receiver, he still probably has better pass catching skills than most running backs. That's like a bad receiver still has better receiving skills than most traditional running backs. And I've heard like the reverse of this argument with Donovan Edwards, who was a non-drafted free agent signing by the Jets, a guy who has a lot of issues at the running back position, but is a good pass catcher. People say they should convert him to receiver. And my response to that is always, well, even if Edwards is a good pass catching back, he still probably has below average receiving skills for a wide receiver. The inverse of that is true with Corley. I think the challenge with Corley is that he's on a team with a loaded backfield. You have Breece Hall, you have Braylon Allen, you have Isaiah Davis. There aren't really many carries to go around. I mean, I don't know that there are enough carries to go around for those three guys to begin with, much less adding an extra guy to that group. So I think I do think the Jets should try everything with Corley. Put him as a return guy, stick him in the backfield during the exhibition season, try and play him at receiver. I mean, one thing I would say is that if the Jets are serious about developing Corley, he should be on the field nonstop during the preseason, because this is your opportunity to get a guy like this actual game reps where mistakes won't hurt your team. And I think that a lot of teams misuse these preseason games. If you're not going to play your starters, at least use them as an opportunity to develop players who maybe a little too raw to play in regular season games, because this is the only time they'll get game reps through the entire season, at least until the NFL develops a true minor league or a true developmental league. Except for like the handful of series where the Jets may play their starters, keep Corley on the field and try everything. Put him in the slot, put him out wide, put him in the backfield. Work on him with his route running, work on him with his playmaking ability when he's got the ball in his hands, develop manufactured touches for him. That's if they're serious about developing. They may not be. This is a new regime that has no ties to Corley, so I don't know if they're serious. But I think if they are serious, they should just try everything and see if he takes like any of these skills, because I think it's getting late for Corley. He may only be in year 2, but it's time for him to show some skills. Otherwise, I think time could be running out on him. And our next question, John, seems like the Jets injury list is growing in training camp. There's been a lot of talk about Aaron Glenn running a more physical camp. Could this be the culprit? I mean, I think that's the easy storyline. And yeah, the injury list has been growing. If you saw yesterday, number of players, including Mason Taylor, went down with an injury. Mason Taylor has a high ankle sprain. Will McDonald has back spasms. Coward, the defensive tackle they signed in the offseason, is also banged up. I mean, of these injuries, Mason Taylor is the one that kind of has me concerned, because I think he's just a guy who needs to get up to speed. He needs the practice reps. I do think the practice reps are valuable for him as he learns his craft, as he learns the technique of the tight end position. I think falling behind in training camp because of injury, is something that won't be great for him. I mean, my hope with Mason Taylor has never been that he was going to be a great tight end day one. It was just that because he's going to be pressed into starting duty, he'll have a real education in the NFL. He'll get up to speed really fast on the nuances because he'll get a lot of game reps in the regular season. But I'd love for him to get as advanced as he can before the regular season starts, and that means being on the practice field, working a lot in training camp with the first team. And I think any reps he loses, won't be they're not going to be the end of his career, but it'll be one further rep he's behind as the regular season begins. But I don't know that there's anything to that. I don't know that Aaron Glenn's practices are too tough because by today's NFL standards, a tough practice would still be probably the least tough practice in the NFL 15 years ago. I think the pendulum has really swung. I think the players' union in the NFL is not very effective, but one of the few things they have gotten concessions on are reducing the number of practices and the intensity of these practices. So even Aaron Glenn running a relatively tough practice compared with other teams, compared with past Jets coaches, it's not that intense of a training camp. It's far less intense than the camps Glenn went through when he was a player himself under Bill Parcells. That's for sure. It's training camp. Guys get injured. That's just something that happens. There's a difference between being in good condition, where you're in great shape, and being in football shape, where you're used to, making the cuts, where you're used to stopping and starting, where you're used to taking hits. I mean, the hits aren't that tough in training camp, but they're still tougher than you're used to just working out on your own. So this is the time of year where guys get banged up. I don't think there's anything there that puts it on Glenn, and I don't think there's a lot out there that suggests the Jets are having an inordinate number of injuries compared with other teams. I think it's an easy storyline because the Jets have, you certainly heard in the media people making a big deal out of how tough the Jets training camp is, but I don't know that there's a lot there that suggests that Glenn's running a camp that's too tough and guys are getting hurt because of it. And look, at the end of the day, you'd rather have guys a little tired now. If training camp gets them ready for the season, maybe other teams will, maybe Jets guys, let's just play devil's advocate here. Let's say Jets guys are getting worn out now. Well, but this training camp will eventually get them into shape. By the time you get to the regular season, maybe other teams will be worn out and the Jets will be in good shape. That's the glass half full scenario. But I still don't know that I really believe that Glenn is running an inordinately tough training camp, and that's the reason guys are getting hurt. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and you're listening on a podcast first, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Thursday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.